Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint this iron cross flower. This plant is also called a lucky clover, and the iron cross name comes from the leaves, which have this dark cross-like shape. We will practice wet on wet technique here, but also we will use some negative painting. Start from masking out the main shape of the flower on the right hand side. For masking I'm using a water brush filled with soapy water and my tried and tested art masking fluid by Winsor & Newton. Pour some of the masking fluid on a palette and quickly close the bottle. Now apply the masking fluid on the edges of the flower and on the stamens in the center. We're applying masking fluid only on this flower because to create the shape of the flower on the left hand side, we will use the negative painting technique. I found that using this kind of water brush for applying a masking fluid is a pretty good idea. I took this idea from Yuko Nagayama. From time to time I'm squeezing the brush so that soapy water flows through the bristles and cleans them. If there are some dry masking particles, I just rub the bristles on a paper towel to remove them, squeezing the brush at the same time. Apply masking also on the stamens of the left-hand side flower. Leave everything to dry. While it's drying, prepare some paint. We're gonna need quinacridone gold, permanent rose and some greens, sap green and dark perylene green. We can also mix sap green with quinacridone gold to make a warmer and lighter green. Be generous and prepare a good amount of paint because you don't want to run out of it while painting. Now using a wash brush, apply a water glaze on the whole background. In this case we have 3 sections of the background, one big on the left and 2 smaller sections on the right side of the main flower, so we can work in sections. Now apply the main color that you can see in the photo. Let all the colors mingle on the paper. When you drop in the paint, let it flow. Apply the greens where you see green and pink where you see pink. Don't worry if the green flows on the pink petals, that's fine. Only try to maintain some white areas on the petals. Later, using the negative painting technique, we will cut out the shape of the flower on the left side. Now we just want to apply the main colors in the background. Once you drop in the color, just leave it, let it flow and let it live its own life. Try not to think about the shapes that you can see now in the background, that you can see a flower there, that there are some stamens, there are some lines on the flower petals. Now try to focus only on the colors that you can see in the reference photo. Leave everything to dry. Now we are going to use some negative painting. Here you can see a clear division between the pink petal and the green background. We could create it as well, but I actually like how the green mingled here with the pink, and I'm going to leave it. This will be my lost edge receding to the background. But we can apply the paint in other places to create the shape of the flower. Now using permanent rose, apply the paint between the petals. Work wet on dry and use a watered down paint to avoid getting hard edges. Now I'm rotating my board because it will be easier for me to paint. I'm spraying my paint with a clean water because it has already dried, so I'm just reactivating it. And now working wet on dry, apply the green around the petals. You can also work wet on wet if you like, but wet on dry will give you some more control. Now here we have a transition from pink to green. Use permanent rose, apply it wet and dry close to the petals, and then rinse and blot your brush, and with a clean brush just blend it in. Now we're going to apply the paint in the center. Make sure everything is totally exceptionally bone dry, and with a wash brush apply a water glaze on the center, but drag the water also on the petals. Wait a moment, let the water settle down for a minute, and now drop in the green paint and let it flow. The more water you have on your paper, the more spreading will be. So you can wait a few moments until the water soaks in a bit if you want more control. Don't panic. Whatever happens will be fine. It's just a painting. No one can see what you are doing, so don't be afraid. As you can see, the paint is flowing like crazy, but that's fine. I expected that. Now we want to cut out the petal shape on the left side. Apply a water glaze around it. Of course, everything should be bone dry. And then drop in some permanent rose and smooth everything out. Do the same in the upper part. When we are working wet on wet like that, a water glaze should always cover a much bigger area that you want to cover with paint. This is because we need to give some space for the paint to flow. If we applied a water glaze on a small area, the paint would flow in the water and it would stop suddenly where the water stops. We would end up with a hard edge, and we don't want that. Giving more space for the paint allows it to flow freely, creating a soft edge. Now when everything is dry, we're going to apply those stripes on the petals. Prepare a mix of permanent rose, Winsor red deep, and some perylene green to darken the mix. Using a smaller brush, here I'm using a size 2, apply the paint wet on dry. Rinse and blot your brush and soften the tip of the stripe so that it blends in with the petal. If you have a rigger brush, it may also work here. Try to follow the shapes according to the reference photo. Don't paint super straight lines. The way they are painted also affects the form of the petal. They should be a little bit curved. With a scrubber brush, soften the ends of these stripes. I decided to darken this part a little bit more, so I applied a water glaze, and this time working wet on wet, I dropped in some dark green. The tone of this section was just too light in comparison with the background on the right hand side of the painting. I did the same here, just to match the tonal values. Now remove the masking fluid from the stamens and apply quinacridone gold on them. Drop in some green to create a subtle shadow at the bottom side. Now let's move on to the main flower. Remove the masking fluid from the edges, but leave it on the stamens. After removing the masking fluid, the edges are too sharp and they are not so clean, so use a scrubber brush to smooth out all the edges. With a damp brush, tease the paint on the edge and lift it out with a tissue. Prepare a lot of permanent rose. Now we'll be working wet on wet, so we don't want it to run out during the painting. Make sure to change your water. It's probably not so clean now. Now apply a water glaze on one petal. We'll be painting one petal at a time. You can see here I'm using a different brush. It's a silvered black velvet. just because I want to use a different brush for applying water and a different one for applying the paint. Wait a few moments and drop in permanent rows. Let it spread. Tilt your board to help the paint flow in the right direction, but don't panic. If it is spreading too much, the world will not end. It's just a painting after all. Just leave it or lift out some of the paint with a clean brush. Draw conclusions from this. How much water did you use? At what point did you add the paint? How wet was your paint? Was it spreading too much? If so, then probably there was too much water on the paper. So before adding the paint, maybe try to wait a little bit longer, maybe 15 seconds longer until the sheen is not so high. Maybe this time you can also use a little bit thicker paint, because the thicker paint, the less spreading there is. Try to play with it. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you have to feel the right moment. It really comes with practice, but you have to observe what you are doing and how the paint is reacting. So most importantly, I would say that you have to observe your paper, how wet it is, how much water you have on your paper. Try to look at your paper from an angle. It is always easier to see how wet is the paper. And I would say that there are like 3 main stages. One of them is when you have a lot of water on your paper, when you see a puddle of water, and then you know that it is a little bit too much, so you have to get rid of this excess water by just sweeping your brush across the shape and removing the excess water. Then the second stage is when you have a high sheen on the paper. There are no puddles, there are no spots which are starting to dry out, but you have just like an even glaze of water when you can see that the paper is wet, but it's not so super wet that you have those puddles of water. And this is the right moment to apply the paint. And the third stage is when your water glaze starts to dry out, when you can see patches of almost dry paper. It's not dry, it's still moist, it's damp, but it's not dry yet. But at this stage, it's better not to add paint because you run the risk of getting blooms. So at this stage, you can add a little bit more water so that the paper is not dry, and only then add some paint. But don't add the paint when you see that the paper is starting to dry out. Try to leave some space in the center of the flower because we will add green in the center, so we don't want the pink and the green to mix together because we will get mud, we will get some brown color. As you can see, when I'm adding the paint, it is spreading gently. It's forming like a cloudy soft edge. The important thing is to let go. Really, don't try to control it too much. Once you apply the paint, just let go. If you try to move the paint around too much, if you start adding more paint here and there while it's starting to dry out, it will not work. You will get an overworked look. It just has to work on its own. Always keep in mind that the paint will follow the water and it will spread. So sometimes just one drop of paint is enough because it will cover a bigger area. Keep that in mind. On these petals, we want to maintain some of the whiteness of the paper. We apply a water glaze on the whole petal, but we are dropping in the paint only on small areas because we know it will spread. But we don't want the paint to cover the entire petal, so we don't apply too much paint on a too big area. Just enough to spread a bit and leave some white areas. Leave everything to dry. When it's totally super incredibly bone dry, wet the center of the flower, but again drag the water on the petals as well. Use a wash brush and touch the paper very gently. We don't want to disturb the previous layer. Now drop in some green gold, quinacridone gold, sap green and perylene green in the darkest places. The closer to the center, the darker the colors. Here the paint is spreading too much, so I just stop the spreading by sweeping a clean brush through the paint and lifting it out. Each time you lift out the paint, rinse and blot your brush to make sure it's clean. You don't want to drag the paint from one place to another. After a few moments, when the colors have settled, I'm adding a dark green. Leave everything to dry, and when it's dry, repeat the process from the previous flower. With a mix of permanent rose, Windsor red deep and some perylene green, paint the stripes on the petals. Soften them towards the tips of the petals and take a closer look at the pattern they form. This time they branch, they are not just simple straight lines, so make sure to follow the reference photo carefully. Of course, you don't have to paint each line exactly as it is in the reference photo, but just try to recreate the overall look of the pattern. Press your brush a little bit more to paint a wider stripe and barely touch the paper to narrow it down. Try to use different tonal values as well. Add some more paint in some areas, maybe add some more permanent rose at the ends of the stripes. Here you can also see my water container and my paper towel. Notice how many times I rinse my brush. If I want to soften the end of the stripe, then I rinse my brush, 2 quick swipes or one longer on the paper towel, and softening. Also, when I want to load my brush with paint, I dip it in water, then blot it on a paper towel, and then I pick up some paint. Sometimes when I see that my paint is starting to dry out, I only dip my brush in water and then give my paint a good mix, a good stir to activate it. If the paint is dry, it means that the water has evaporated, hence I dip my brush in water, but I don't blot it. This way I transfer the water to my paint and the consistency of the paint is still the same. Continue working on the stripes and leave everything to dry. Now when it's incredibly gorgeously bone dry, apply a water glaze on the center and add some more dark green. We want to create a little bit more depth here. The center should look like it's deep, so we need a little bit darker tone here. Smooth out any hard edges and let everything dry. When it's dry, use a scrubber brush to lift out the paint and create some stamens. Tease the paint with a damp brush and lift it out with a tissue. Now remove the masking fluid and apply Winsor Yellow. Here we are applying Winsor Yellow because it's brighter than quinacridone gold, and the center of the flower is in the light. In the previous flower we applied quinacridone gold, which is like a muted version of yellow, and we used it there because the center of that flower was more in the shadow. Here we can drop in some green to introduce some variety in color. We can also apply the green on the stamens from which we have just lifted out the paint. And it's ready. Now we can remove the masking tape. Here I also have a brown gummed tape which comes off easily from the gator board, but I have to cut out the painting. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Maybe you've learned something useful which you can use in your own paintings. Thank you very much for watching and have a lovely day.